Hello and welcome. Welcome to Stevenson Harwood. Welcome to this, the latest in our series of seminars that we're running on issues in hydrogen. I think the single biggest challenge we've got this evening is to persuade you not to look at your phones and see what's going on in Westminster. So we will do our very best to keep our attentions on matters above, namely hydrogen. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jonathan Cripps. I'm one of the partners in the projects and infrastructure team specialising in renewable energy. I also head up the decarbonisation practice within the firm. Within decarbonisation, there isn't much, of course, that has greater potential than hydrogen itself. Hydrogen, with its famed versatility, that ability to be deployed in so many different uses, means that it's long been regarded as one of the potential saviours for decarbonisation. But at the same time, there are, of course, those doubters who say, can hydrogen ever really live up to that kind of billing? So I think this seminar this evening is really well timed because it asks us to consider whether the 2030 and 2050 hydrogen targets can be met. I think at the heart of that question is really this one. Is there enough demand and potential demand for low carbon hydrogen, which when you combine it with all the various government interventions which are being put in place, there's an assumption there that they will continue, notwithstanding today. Does that combination of demand and government interventions, is that enough to make developers and their investors say, yes, we will invest in production facilities, we will get on and start producing low carbon hydrogen? So in other words, we have a demand side, a supply side, government interventions in the middle, attempting to join the two sides up and over time creating a market. So to address these issues and doubtless more besides, we have an absolutely fantastic lineup of three speakers this evening. So I'm now going to pass you over to Cathal Lee Doyle to make the introductions for us and then moderate our discussion. Cathal.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it's great to see some regular faces and some new faces. Unfortunately, despite assuring me over the last number of weeks that Boris Johnson would be attending this evening, he surprised us, I think all of you, by confirming today that he would not be actually attending. So he sends his apologies, but unfortunately something's come up in number 10. But on a positive note, and it'll be interesting to see if that was a tactical decision made at the upper echelons of government. Today's been a historical day. Most of you will be well aware of the round 4 allocation being announced today and seeing 5 CFD awards for fixed offshore wind at just over £37 strike price. And then when we look at the new technology side of the floating wind, also being successful for a CFD and achieving a strike price of just over 87. Yesterday, also a huge announcement from Shell announcing that their green project, a green hydrogen project in the Netherlands, which will be the largest in Europe, successfully passed FID, which leaves us with no uncertainty that we are lucky enough to have front row seats to the green revolution. And it's a very exciting time to be in the sector. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Cathal Lee Doyle. I'm a senior associate here at Stevenson Harwood, and I specialise on onshore and offshore renewable energy. Over the last 2 years, we've been hosting these hydrogen seminars, essentially so that our clients and contacts can get to grips with and keep up with hydrogen technology developments and also the possibilities that exist in the sector. Given hydrogen projects are getting announced on a bigger scale nearly weekly globally at the minute, I think personally the major issue is that we stay realistic on what's achievable in the United Kingdom and what's possible, and that in order to keep it as accurate and realistic as possible, we avoid the possibility of hydrogen becoming another fad, as unfortunately it has in historical times. That said, I completely appreciate that there's a lot to be done in the sector, and I've asked all of our speakers this evening, in order to make this as useful as possible for everyone, to not give hypothetical answers, to not say what they would wish what the scenario was, but to give answers as if they were making the business decisions today. Because essentially that is what is needed to be undertaken by everyone involved in the sector in order for us to start meeting our goals for 2030 and also 2050. Now that the context of this evening's discussions are out of the way, I'd like to introduce our panel of 3 hydrogen experts. Starting on my furthest left, we've got William Rowe, CEO and founder of Octopus Hydrogen. Now, Shekhar Sumit, who's a member of Sizewell C's financing and economic regulatory team, and also head of the energy transition at Sizewell C. And then last but not least, we've Marco Dell'Aquila, who is the CIO of Protium, chairman and co-founder of Inspiratia, and in his spare time is an adjunct professor of Johns Hopkins University. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Again, it's much appreciated. I'm delighted you could be here with us this evening. We're going to start at a high view. Government's target is 10 gigawatts of low carbon production before 2030. An ambitious target, I think everyone will agree, especially when you consider that's only 8 years away. Over the last number of years, we've been very aware of the successes of some of the accelerator programs, the funding that's available, and a lot of focus recently has been on the 240 million pot of the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund. What we found quite interesting is Strand 1 is done, Strand 2 is currently open, and the government's pre-requirement is that projects will only be successful if it's a credible project that will contribute to the at-scale production of low-carbon hydrogen by 2025. So my maths, that's 3 years away. Where do you think the hydrogen market should be focusing when we're looking at such short timescales, and why? Floor is yours.
Well, I guess if it's all right, I'll give you our first answer to that one. So we've submitted an application for the Strand 2 of the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund. And for us, it was relatively straightforward because we already had 4 projects that were effectively through our own internal FID process. So we were happy to go on them. And then we just picked the one that was the worst project because it wasn't going to get hydrogen. We didn't want to waste it to not get the hydrogen business model. So we just put the worst one into Net Zero Hydrogen Fund, which was, so unlike, I guess, others that had to kind of squabble around to try and make a project fit, we're like, well, it's already green. We've already got the technology procured for it. All the fundamentals of the contracts are done for those. We've already got the offtake. Literally just, okay, we just got to do 3 days of paperwork and it was done. So it's quite an easy one for us.
And that was simply focusing on the financial side of it, or was that sector specific?
Help me on that one.
So what I'm trying to get at is was that very focused on like heavy industries? Are the clusters?
Yeah. Well, so our model is to build green hydrogen production facilities that are typically co-located with renewables, and then use an element of grid sleeved and temporally correlated PPA back power to do that. So we don't look to build the project at the point of use. Now, I don't think those projects are fundamentally flawed where they're at the point of use. I just think they're a different model. So you're typically going to be looking at refineries or bigger projects that require a longer, it's harder to understand where the land is and how you feed that into the application. Whereas because our project is someone is building some solar or someone is building some wind and we're not the ones building that, they've already gone through the long process to get those things consented. So all we need to do is say, we want to lease a small bit of land, typically less than an acre, but maybe a bit more, and then add on a project to that. So it's really just a commercial deal around the PPA, and then we've just got to get planning and permitting done. And the risk of those is not that high. So the kind of DevEx end of the project is relatively cheap for us to do. And because of that, we can serve multiple customers with that hydrogen. So it works quite well for our business model, I suppose. Whereas I think for other business models, the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund timelines and kind of scope was probably a bit limited in that scope. I don't know what you call it, second tranche anyway. Whereas the HBM ones further down the year will be probably more suited to those.
Yes, Strand 3 and 4.
I think so, yeah.
Well, I guess Protium's the other sort of extreme, still distributed, still green, but we are co-located with solar wind, which we're developing, and with the industrial customers. So that makes our projects longer term, more difficult, and the development budget much larger. So we didn't avail ourselves of that fund, but we will be looking at the hydrogen business model, which I'm reliably told will be announced before the recess, but that was before today, so maybe that's going to be kicked into the long grass. For us, it's really about kind of sustainability of your own renewables feeding the electrolyzer and then feeding the client. We have different models, but one of the ones that's been announced is our South Wales project with Anheuser-Busch, and that's really a dedicated facility, much like a sort of a cogen plant selling heat. So it's a pretty standard model. Difficulty is, of course, the planning and And for that, I think hydrogen business model makes a lot of sense. It's also hard to answer your question because we view it from our perspective, and I think Will and I look at similar scale projects. We don't maybe look at the larger macro.
Yeah,
scale.
we're probably both in the kind of
tens,
tens of megawatts, not hundreds or thousands of megawatts.
And of course, we would justify the importance of those. But then, as a government policymaker, you would say, how many tens of projects do you need to
actually get to the target?
Yeah, although I think before Shell get their 200 megawatt project live, we'll have more than 200 megawatts built. So by the time the biggest project comes online in Europe, we'll have more gas.
You'll have more than two, and we'll have more than two. So that's it's half a gigawatt between us. So it was that kind of short, medium, long-term perspective. Things are going to develop on the large scale, but it's going to take a hell of a long time. So hopefully we'll be built.
Well, I think the challenge of the really big ones as well is you've got the dependency on the off-takers. Is you can't typically get a single off-taker unless it's a refinery or ammonia or something that needs hundreds of megawatts in a single place. So then you're trying to cluster, or you're trying to create multiple business models around that, and then you've got dependencies on different people's creditworthiness, appetites, etc. Whereas I guess the beauty of those kind of tens of megawatts projects is you're not building the renewables as well, the capital expense isn't that great. People can take a view on it. And B, you're producing tons of hydrogen a day, not 20, 30, 40 tons, which is, you really need a big application to be kind of using that, or it needs to be dumped into the gas network, which is going to struggle commercially to get there, I think.
I think that's actually a really interesting point for me to come in from a Sizewell C perspective, because on the other side of the coin, where we are right now is, of course, Sizewell C is a nuclear power station, and the point in time at which we may be entering into the hydrogen generation landscape, maybe when Sizewell C becomes operational, which would be in about a decade or so's time. But where we are right now is essentially as a hydrogen consumer. So one of the things that we are looking to do is we are looking to essentially convert our bus fleet, our construction equipment, into something that is powered by hydrogen, not by diesel. So as in, I know you mentioned towards the beginning, Cathal, about talking in concrete numbers. So for example, we are looking to procure close to 190 odd buses, which would be one of the largest bus procurement orders in the continent. We want that to be hydrogen driven. And just based on some of the calculations we have carried out, we think we'll be requiring somewhere in the region of 3 million kilograms of hydrogen just to power the buses. And what we're also trying to do is we are trying to speak with the other stakeholders in the area. So we have ports, we have local authorities, we have industrial consumers who are similarly interested in hydrogen as well. And one of the really interesting insights that we came to was the fact that although there is a lot of interest in being hydrogen consumers, in isolation, it is difficult for entities to actually go and be a participant in the hydrogen ecosystem. But on the other hand, if, for example, if Sizewell C, we can play the role of almost, so to speak, a demand aggregator, and we can help pull together these various elements together. And if you also think about it, it's not just about the hydrogen itself as a fuel, it's also about the associated infrastructure. So be it refueling facilities, be it everything else that you need around the hydrogen fuel element itself. You can actually bring together a lot of different stakeholders to come into it as a picture as a whole. So of course, like Marco and William, as in from the production perspective, but on the other side of the coin, from the demand side as well, you need to have people with that level of demand who are able to actually go and engage with the market.
I agree, because at the end, it's delivering a kind of competitive levelized cost of hydrogen. The more infrastructure you have as part of the business model, the higher the levelized cost. So Will's model is very, very elegant. I mean, we picked ours in a sense because we're targeting industrial users, but not refineries or steel companies, but we're targeting consumer companies because we think that they are more likely to take decarbonization seriously. And that's a kind of corporate choice. We look around and we see, well, if you're creating intermediate products, you're really only going to decarbonize when government sits on you and makes you scream. Whereas if you're a company that is constantly selling consumer products, is shareholder facing, then they're more likely to, at least if they say they're going to decarbonize, to actually do it. And that's the experience we've found.
Yeah, I think it's a great strategy, because what I really like about it as well is, I think I saw in the press the partnership with Quorn.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like getting on a diesel train. Over time, I've got an EV. Why would I get on a diesel train? No, it's probably net on grid average, probably better to be on the diesel train from a CO2 perspective. But over time, that's not going to be the case, right? And so trains have to go quite quickly. And it's the same with a product like corn, right? Part of corns, I mean, obviously some people do it due to moral reasons, but a lot of people go down the sort of veggie vegan route more because of sustainability reasons, or as much because of that as other. And so for a brand like corn, you can't have, but your CO2 footprint's terrible. They really want to go early on that. And, and things like beers make sense to me as well, because the marginal cost difference is negligible. So,
but it does become tricky, because how much are you willing to pay more?
I'd pay more for what it's
you
worth.
would, and I would, and then you go to procurement of the large industrial company, and they say, we pay this much, and you say, well, have you heard of the word externality? And they
that's why the cement sector is terrible. The cement sector is the one, don't go near that.
Refineries.
But then just to go back to the original question, because what it sounds like there is we know our target that we have to achieve, but rather than saying, right, we're going to focus on this specific sector or this specific issue in order to increase our decarbonization or to at least achieve our target, you're kind of giving me answers that it's nearly the developers that are leading the approach of saying, right, this is where we're going to be able to provide hydrogen. So it's nearly developer led.
But it always has been wind, solar. I mean, it's always been developer led. So why would it be any different? The other thing is also time based. I mean, both you guys have said it takes many years to build a massive scale. Hundreds of megawatts project, especially if it's relying on new offshore wind, let's say. What's going to happen between now and when those projects are delivered, let alone discussions about, bringing in cryogenic hydrogen, from North Africa, etc. Those are going to take decades. I suppose what Will and I are saying, between now and when those things will be done, there will be people like us doing distributed small scale. I don't think you can do large scale in a short period of time. The planning doesn't allow you.
Yeah, I agree.
So it's essentially a kind of a building block. You build the smaller blocks and you can achieve as much as we can achieve. I mean, it's difficult to say. And then in the medium to long term, these larger macro projects will come in and will completely change the market.
I think where I have seen good policy from certain governments, so India's hydrogen strategy is to push green hydrogen effectively blended with the grey hydrogen that's used in the refineries. And I like that because it's a very clear, you can either do it the way we do it here, which is, well, we'll see what projects are there and then decide where to put some money and create some business models around those. We're not going to pick sectors and applications particularly, or you could do it that way and say, well, there's just a hard target. I think it's 15% green it's a relatively quite close date. Well, at least it just gives a super clear signal to the market. You've got lots of inbounds we see around projects, funding projects, electrolyzer procurement, because it's just given a super clear signal as to where the market in India specifically is. And you almost don't need to worry about all the other projects. So mobility projects will come after those big ones, And it's also very sensible because they currently flare absolutely tons of grey hydrogen every day. So it's a really good strategy if they can get rid of some of that.
Because the one that I think is very stark is Equinor's announcement of the H2H project, which is also gone for Strand 2 funding out of the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund. And there is 10 gigawatts to be operational by 2028, but that would achieve 18% of our target. And when I read those statistics and I hear what's going on in the market and we see what's crossing our desk here at SH, I ask the question, are these goals ever achievable?
Carl, do you actually believe that number?
This is being recorded, so
Have you been to electrolyzer manufacturers?
Well, I know, and there's all of these questions which we'll get to. You can't jump early. This is the first question. But again, then, so let's ignore Equinor's statistic. Do we think the goal is achievable as a yes/no answer? Is the goal actually achievable? No. That's one from Marco.
No, not ever.
No, it's just a yes/no now. Yeah.
Are we going to do is the EU's?
No, just focus on the UK goal right here. And this, I'm going to get to it later, but this comes down to bankability, the predictability.
Remind me what the exact details of the goal. 5 gigawatts for green. I'm ignoring the blue because that's easy. Anyway.
Well, they say aspirational 5 gigawatts will be from
by 2030. Is that operational
2030
or in development? I've not checked the details.
I don't have the definition here.
No, it's operational.
If it's operational, it's probably challenging.
Okay, so on a
It'd be
yes, no, Will.
No.
No.
And do you mean based on the current regulatory landscape, not what it might potentially look like, let's say in a year or a couple of years' time?
You'd swear 4 lawyers were sitting up on this stand rather than just 2. Okay?
How many
Yeah.
caveats?
You literally, I feel now unprepared that I
avoidance
don't
of
have the
doubt.
definition here and all the pack. Let's just go with the Daily Mail headline. Yes or no, 10 gigawatts
Today, as
of
of now,
low carbon hydrogen production in
be
the UK.
challenging. I agree with that.
Okay, so that's 3 no's. That really took a long time to. Okay.
We could do one-word answers all night, and then
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We'll see, and then the crowd will just join in as we go.
Why don't you ask the audience what they think?
We can do very quickly. Show of hands. Does anyone have confidence in the goal can be achieved for 2030? That's a resounding no. So yeah, but
I mean, at the end of the day, it's just a cheap press release. You know, it's a big company, big balance sheet. Why not say something stupid? I mean, it's, you know, who's going to be blamed for it? You're just expressing your enthusiasm, really. You're not actually saying anything concrete or.
But we'll come to where I think it matters later on, because I think it is all about the confidence in the sector. Well,
helps a bit.
But can I make one point though? As in, even though I said no, I still think that the government can create policy circumstances, the landscape, so as to be able to, if not at least deliver that vision, to come quite close to delivering that vision.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to create, like, for example, I'll give you one simple example. Nuclear energy can provide electricity to produce hydrogen. In the last couple of years, there have been instances where nuclear power plants have been curtailed. Under the grid curtailment mechanics, significant amounts of money have been paid to nuclear energy to stay shut so as not to provide electricity to the grid. That kind of electricity could actually have been used for hydrogen production. However, having said that, so let's say if you have hydrogen that is produced via renewables that benefits from the RTFO, if it is used for transportation purposes, that of course does not apply to nuclear because nuclear is not renewable by definition. Now, because there's lack, for example, of a level playing field between the different low carbon technologies, I have personally been in a number of discussions as regards the potential role that nuclear energy can play in hydrogen production. But there are some policy challenges which in a way act as a bit of an impediment in terms of, for example, delivering that narrative. And this is, again, a very isolated example. I'm sure there would be other examples across various other sectors and technologies as well. Yeah. So even though I said no, things can change for the better, but it probably does require a bit of innovation, a bit of forward thinking in order to drive that forward.
But physically, and sorry to ask a question, but physically, how could you achieve that? Because then you'd have to have massive scale storage at the nuclear plants. And that massive scale storage would then have to be blended into the gas grid. So it's kind of a...
Yeah, no, I agree with you. As in a way, it is,
as
again,
an engineer, that's how I begin to think about how you'd actually do all those things.
Yeah, it's
that's
I was speaking about more in terms of the capacity, in terms of being able to power a relevant technology type. But absolutely, as you say, as in you require, the storage element, you require the consumption elements. So of course, all of those bits need to tie in together as well. But overall, as in, it could work out depending on the direction of travel otherwise as well.
Yeah. I think everyone agrees with that kind of sentiment generally.
We've taken you off piste in terms of Q&A.
No, we're only warming up. Right, moving on now to actually the contracting side of things. The UK consultation on the UK hydrogen business model concluded in April. Government has confirmed that it's hoping to be able to circulate the finalised business model later this year, and that the first contracts will actually be entered into in 2023. In terms of here today, William, you touched on it at the start, which I thought was quite interesting. You've already gone through a lot of the work behind the contracting side of it. But my particular question, which I have for all three of you, is how today in your negotiations for getting hydrogen off the ground, are you dealing with the technology risk, the volume risk, and the pricing risk? And I appreciate we could talk for several hours, and I have no fear you would all be very good at it. But if we break it down to get a snapshot on each one. So if we start with technology, how are we dealing with technology risk in the contracts when you are going out to market and you're having those discussions and then putting pen to paper?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think so. just a lesson learned from our side on this. So we bought one lower TRL level solution and one that was deployed elsewhere. So in theory was more mature. Both 1 megawatt systems. We did the due diligence ourselves, just kind of committed quite early. And I think what we learned through that experience was actually you can kind of park the worry about whether it's PEM, whether it's pressurized alkaline, whether it's cryogenic, whatever the method is of making the hydrogen. And I'd also say you can park all the small demonstrators of all the projects you've seen. And really, what you want to see is the product at the scale you're buying installed somewhere, ideally working in anger with all the documentation and the safety cases. And then our lesson has been everything else doesn't count. All the rest of it is just great. Yeah, that's really useful. Well done, you. But show me the product I'm going to buy. Or you are in the full world of all the technology risk is with you. So I think for the first 2 sites, we can live with that risk on our own balance sheet and we're fine with that. We wouldn't buy a project that we can't see the electrolyzer for. We wouldn't buy an electrolyzer that we can't see in anger for a 10 megawatt plus site. It just wouldn't do it at all, no. And fundamentally, splitting water is not that complex. So it's not that bit's hard. It's all the rest of it. It's, what's your power? What's your water purification? How does your water purification handle different power loads? All these small things that you don't realize until the project goes live and you go, oh, right, it turns out that drying hydrogen from oxygen, so deoxy dryers don't like to run at different levels. So the electrolyzer might, but the oxygen separation doesn't.
Yep.
So, that's something who knows that? I didn't know that. And, I own 2 electrolyzers.
Yeah,
So
because that's something we're already seeing that when it comes to the specs of what it's actually been agreed to.
Yeah.
And that's where, well, it's a lawyer's dream or a nightmare, depending on if you're in the non-contentious or contentious space, but is getting that spec right and then being able to back the spec 2 years later or 4 years, or if you've had planning issues, you can even add on another year or 2, and how you really manage that if the spec is changing, be it water pressure, be it the purity required out of the electrolyzer.
Yeah. But it's even like, for me, it's things like, so let's say it's obvious that you'd spec when you buy an electrolyzer, you want 99.99% pure. But I didn't think you'd need to specify, I want that at every different power output the electrolyzer can run at. Or, I want an electrical efficiency of 55 kilowatt hours per kilogram.
Yeah.
I'd like 40, but I'm not going to get that. So I'll take 50. I want that every power potential I can give the electrolyzer, not at the selected one you picked off your perfect chart where the best spot was. I want it at all of these ones. So what I don't want is when I run it at a low power, I get 80 kilowatt hours per kilogram, because all of a sudden, therefore, I can't use the electrolyzer in all the different scenarios. And these are things that I guess you only learn by actually owning one and trying to operate it. So basically, I'm saying technology risk is a pain.
Shall I go next?
Yeah.
Well, I've lived technology risk since 1989 when I started doing projects. I've done IGCC, integrated gasification combined cycles, pyrolysis gasification, different kind of gasification. It's inherent in all projects. If I were to place kind of electrolysis in that panorama, including batteries, I would say it's not particularly risky, but who cares what I think? It depends how you're going to finance the project. If you've got an equity that's willing to finance risky projects, that's fine. Our model is project financing. So that sets the whole strategy of how we look at projects. So for us, bankability is key. Our investors expect us to go through that kind of process. And so for us, one of the first things that Chris, my co-founder, and I did when we set up the company is we tried to look for an EPC contractor, and we wanted an EPC proper, not EPCM, and that took a bit of time. Then we didn't want somebody who could build wind turbines, because I can build a wind turbine, to be honest with you, but somebody who understood complexity. So we went to some contractors that understood oil refineries, petrochem plants, and that's why we ended up partnering with Petrovac. Then the second thing is, with EPC, go to EPC, they deal with technology risk. No, we weren't comfortable with that. We said, and we've got a technology agreement with Siemens, so we only want you to buy Siemens. That's it. Because I don't think Without those elements, and you can substitute different EPCs, different manufacturers. We just happen to choose those two. You can't make the project bankable. It still may not be project financeable, but you have to have those elements in there. Now, there's a big debate as to whether the sector will evolve into an EPCM managing different types of contracts. But I think at the moment, if you go to banks and they're looking for leverage over 50% of project value, you've got to be very, very belts and braces, and you've got to have all your ratios right. So that's how we look at technology risk. Don't assume anything. Go to bankable counterparties and mitigate the entire risk. I mean, it doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter. I mean, we have a little Enapta unit. It's more than yours, and it's great. We're going to be commissioning that in about a month's time. And, we can show people that we produce hydrogen. But what does it actually mean? Nothing at all. Sorry to say that. Because, our full-scale PEM electrolyzer will be totally different technology. Yeah. But it's, it's a little road show that we can do. And, the 1 megawatts don't really have that much or aren't really analogous to our big industrial projects, or relatively big for us, tens of megawatts. And I agree with you, Will. You have to go. You have to see who's built them. You've got to see the contract. You've got to see what level of LDs they're going to be willing to give you. And then even with that, then you have to have a team that can manage the assets in addition to an O&M contract. So in our company, we're 40 now, which is frightening because we started with 3 2 years ago. I would say about 30, 33, 34 engineers. So, your bids, we're kind of aware, theoretically at least, of all those risks, because we hire engineers whose job it is to tell us that. So.
And then I suppose your angle is going to be very different, because you went out to market asking the technology providers to come to you and give you what was available and what was possible for Sizewell C.
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, when we go and have our discussions with the providers, one of the main questions we ask is essentially technology and resilience, in terms of how we as an off-taker can be assured that we will have access to the hydrogen when we need it, how we need it, to the parameters that we have specified in the contract. So of course, the risk will be passed on by a counterparty to EPC contractors and everything else as part of the contracting structure. But when we have a discussion, that is pretty much the first question that we ask, that how can we be assured that from a technical/resilience perspective, we will have access to the hydrogen in the manner that.
And what answer are you getting?
Well, we receive very good answers in the sense that, of course, we should be fully assured that we will have hydrogen in the way in which we need it. Yeah. But again, like when we go through our various supply chain/procurement processes, that is one of the key elements that we need to tick off the box. So absolutely, as in when Marco and Will were speaking about the technical risk side of things and how the contractual arrangements of the EPC and contractors and others might work. From our perspective, of course, like that is not something that we participate in directly. But when we do participate with the counterparty on the other side, that this is pretty much the first question.
And do you think the power is with the off-taker in that negotiation, saying we don't want any of that risk, we just simply want guaranteed off-take?
Well, our negotiations have not been completed yet, but like that is pretty much what we do ask for, as in we do want certainty. And of course, if like again, your usual suite of contractual arrangements, as in if in case there is a lack of delivery, then you have contractual arrangements to ensure that the supplier provides alternate arrangements or makes liquidated damages. So yeah.
We shouldn't overstate the technology risk. Technology risk is the fear of the unknown.
Yeah, but it's also the timing issue. It is that we've been talking about the development of hydrogen technology for so long, and we're now seeing actually shovels go in the ground. But like we saw for offshore wind in round 1 and 2, is all the planning applications nearly had to be updated by the time actually the project came round, because the technology had been updated so much, the turbine manufacturing process. So I assume that's going to happen in the hydrogen sector.
I think there's an important distinction for me between, so when I think of technology risk, we buy certified products. So I want to buy compressors, storage, and electrolysis, hydrogen production, let's say, power and water in, hydrogen out machines, probably via electrolysis. So where we don't see technology risk is like hydrogen cylinders are not going to burst, and electrolyzers will take power and split the gases. Where the problem comes is, though, okay, so you've done a 1 megawatt system, and a 5 megawatt system isn't the same from a safety perspective as a 1 megawatt system, and a 16 megawatt system that Siemens produces is not the same as a 1 megawatt system they've got that went in a submarine. So there's and bigger places understand that burden and will give you dates and documentation, and it's silly things like. One of our electrolyzers required 2 cranes to lift it rather than 1, which triples your installation cost overnight. So you only do it once, it doesn't matter. But clearly what you don't want to do is end up needing 3 cranes when you're installing it if you're doing 16 of them simultaneously, because it turns out there's only one steel rig thing that can work with 2 cranes simultaneously in the country. So that rig's been allocated. You would literally, the whole project would fall to pieces, or you build your own rig. Those are sort of things you're just like, okay, that's just a real bad design feature. We'll just get away from that and do a single point lift, whatever it's called. I don't know enough about it. But the point being, like, these are things that just shouldn't be happening, right? But it's just, so it's more like the kind of safety cases, documentation, certification. That's the stuff where I see the risk if you're buying products. Now, if you push that into the EPC world and say, design me a project and use these bits in it, but kind of you handle it. They have to wrap that all for you. But that project takes 3 years rather than, in theory, we can deliver something in 18 months because we've got a modular design. So our burden is more, we want the market to be like going out and buying, brakes for cars, not where everyone comes and designs a specific brake pads and calipers and hydraulic systems. We don't want you to design it for us. We just want a load of things that work together like Lego bricks, and that's where the market's not there yet. So that's the technology risk we face, rather than it all doesn't work and it's not safe. It's just.
But then, if you do have your own modularized design, if you try and project finance out, that's going to be tricky.
It'd be easy. We've not moved on to financing yet, so it's fine.
So, I mean, we're just assuming it's going to be very difficult, and so doing the belts and braces. Now, it's the opposite, but it's actually not that different, because you tell the EPC contractor, this is what I want it to look like,
and this is what I need.
And this is what I need.
Yeah.
And that you're going to spend, whatever it is, 12, 15, 18, 20% on top of the EPC contract. But, that's the certainty that a customer like you would want.
We've very consciously gone down that route to say, we don't want to put the burden and the timelines on each one being different. We want to have, so a 5 should look the same as a 20, it's just 4 of the 5. So it's not 20 ones, because ones are very inefficient, but it's 4 5. So we need to do 25, and we're very consciously designing around that methodology. So we're starting to work towards what is the right, and it also gives you redundancy. So if we lose one, we've still got 15, and we can meet targets. So we very consciously are trying to work towards this kind of packaged modular design that will then allow us to have the supply chain sorted, so that every time a site becomes viable in any geography, we've got an 18-month delivery time. And we can run the planning and the permitting in parallel, because we already have all the documentation to support that, subject to localization. So our idea is to be able to cutter that kind of process and keep it fast. Now, and we think that's kind of needed if you're going to be in that low scale at this point, because otherwise that 200 megawatt project Shell are doing would always be bigger than anything. We'd never catch them up. So we're trying to kind of run at that problem and say, well, this is the way we'll get faster than that. But we haven't financed it all yet, Marco, as you say. So
I don't think our approaches are at all different. I mean, I think they kind of meet it. It'll be maybe a bit harder than you think. It might be a bit easier than we think. But at the end of the day, when you go to the financing market, or even if you want third-party equity, a lot of investors are desperate to get their hands on hydrogen. So they're going to be stretching to make it. I mean, they're not going to take projects that are not well designed and well put together, but they will stretch to say, okay, we can take the technology.
And the way I've seen it is every infra fund and every renewables fund needs to demonstrate that they're going to go into the new asset class of hydrogen. So there's enough of them who want to do it.
To be able to put it work.
You don't have to worry too much about capital.
Well, let's move on to pricing then. How are you approaching pricing? That'd be quite interesting, because we nearly have like a client and then an end user versus.
What price do you want to pay?
As low as possible.
Okay,
write it down on this envelope. So how are you approaching pricing?
So we very consciously at the moment don't try and compete with things that are very cheap. So even in today's pricing, gas is cheap. So it's hard for hydrogen for us to get to competing with natural gas. So we effectively are trying to compete with where we think it's easier to do so. So for us, that's 2 things. One, it's grey hydrogen in tube trailers or chloroalkaline hydrogen in tube trailers, because an awful lot of the cost of the hydrogen is effectively not the hydrogen, it's the logistics, the tube trailer, everything else around it. So it's quite easy to compete with that on price. Now, it's not the biggest problem the world faces, but it is a problem that we need to decarbonize, and it's a good way to get going. And the other is things like heavy mobility, and so jet fuels and diesel effectively, and whether that diesel's using auxiliary power or in HGVs. Because of the tax on diesel, it's relatively easy to get to parity, and then aviation is just not that price sensitive. So ultimately, they're the sectors where we see it makes sense to go after from a pricing perspective. Whereas if you go after, say, domestic heat, the challenge is, domestic heat is already a price sensitive. We have fuel poverty, we have lots of issues. So the idea of any marginal increase in the cost of domestic heat is always going to be challenging from a regulatory perspective and a consumer demand perspective. So we just very consciously decided that wouldn't be a good place to go after. You're looking at me as if and therefore the price is.
And therefore my calculation.
I actually sent someone pricing this morning, so we can still get to about £6 a kilo even with today's
I was
power
going to
prices.
use that.
Yeah.
Stolen my thunder. Yeah.
And your confidence, for how long is that foreseeable? And do you give a timing on when they can actually select that pricing?
Today.
Today.
Yeah.
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 Sales 101. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
For the next
today.
24 hours.
Yeah, right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's with power prices where they are now, though. So,
Right.
given that we take an element of the marginal cost of power into our model, we don't build our own renewables. So if it wasn't for where power is, we would have been better.
Mark, you want to go next, or do you want to go as a?
You go next.
Well,
because
no,
I'm just going to waffle
As
on
in,
for
no,
half
absolutely
an hour.
not. No, I was just about to say that I think pricing is such an interesting topic, as in when it comes to low carbon hydrogen. As in, from our perspective, or for that matter, if anybody is going towards low carbon hydrogen, if you look at it from a strictly economic point of view, then there are other things that you can also equally look at. I don't think you can ever look at just in terms of just like pure economics, I would say, at least from our perspective, as in you look at the wider narrative, as in one of the reasons why, of course, we want to go and power our buses and equipment using low carbon hydrogen is to reduce our overall carbon footprint. So there are some other benefits, intrinsic, extrinsic, that also need to be factored in when you look at usage of low carbon hydrogen. And also when you look at emissions, for example, you look at not just like scope 1 emissions, you look at scope 2 emissions, scope 3 emissions as well. So when we are essentially carrying out our business decision as to how much hydrogen to buy, where to buy it from, and how to price it, of course we'll be looking at the economic aspect of it, but we will also be factoring in other elements which are non-economic in nature, in terms of what are the kind of benefits that we receive in terms of reduction of carbon emissions, the kind of social economic benefit that we may realize as a usage of low carbon hydrogen, and so on.
You said low carbon, so this is just a question.
Yeah.
We didn't prep. So would you consider anything other than green hydrogen for the on-site operations? Just because I'm thinking, as a power project, using a non-power derived hydrogen would be quite an interesting sort of, like, there's no reason for you to support blue hydrogen unless I'm missing a shareholder in the background or something.
Well, no, as in the reason I said low carbon instead of green was, and this is something which we try to do generally as
we're going to get into the color debate, are we?
Yeah, I do not, but that's exactly the point. Because, for example, like nuclear hydrogen is called pink hydrogen. There are all these different shades of
green. It's fine. You're with friends.
We're friends.
Yeah, okay.
But the reason why we mentioned low carbon was, for our purposes, what we're looking at essentially is we have like almost like a threshold in mind. So as long as the carbon emission level is below that threshold, we would be willing to consider that.
Is it less than 20 grams of CO2?
Yeah.
Okay. As long as it doesn't include blue, then I'm
but yeah, so that's the point. So of course, economics are a very important factor, but we'll be looking at some wider factors as well.
It's interesting though, because what you find is, for say a truck operator or something, literally, I think I've spoken to every truck operator in the UK in the last 12 months, and every one of them would really like to do something in terms of decarbonisation that's not just HVO. But the problem is, at the moment, it costs them twice the price per mile, and they get absolutely no support, and there's no incentive to do so other than pure PR and brand.
Yeah.
And they all just kind of go, I really want to do it, but it's twice the cost per mile. And then they go, oh, hold on a minute, there's some government money coming soon, isn't there? And I go, yeah, and they go, come back to when that money's there.
Mm-hmm.
So almost the government incentive being there is the problem. If it wasn't going to come, they'd go, actually, do you know what? We can justify this. We can do it, especially some of the supermarkets and stuff where they really want to do. Because they know the government pot's coming along, they're just like, I'll just wait for that then.
That's interesting. Michael, pricing.
Very tricky. So let's think about a model. And the model is you're selling hydrogen to an industrial user that uses it both for heat and mobility, which is what we tend to do. And so there is an element of mobility having a higher value because you're competing against diesel. And there's also the RTFO, which is a credit that you have today and you don't have for heat, or you will do very soon. So actually fulfilling the part that relates to mobility makes sense, and we can compete. £6 works well. Actually, it can be lower. So then the other side of the coin, but the volume is not high. And, having spoken to lots of OEMs, if you wanted a hydrogen fuel cell truck today, it'd be kind of hard to find. So if you're looking at delivering projects 24, 25, 26, you're hoping and assuming that we'll have lots of product to buy, and that's a big question mark. And then the second part of the challenge that we have is the heat. So yeah, I agree with Will. If you're competing, even hydrogen today is hard to compete, but we're not competing with hydrogen for heat. So we bundle it together and we sell energy as a service. So we can sell hydrogen, we can sell oxygen, because that's a product the food industry uses. Not everyone uses it. And we also sell electricity directly. So we're providing a number of services to clients. And then the point you make, I think, very eloquently is the client's not only buying the commodity, they're buying a means to mitigate volatility. So the price of natural gas is extremely volatile, and that's the worst thing for an industrial customer selling a service. Now, some of that risk is mitigated through long-term contract, but they expire over time. So what I think hydrogen can do is can provide a known quantity of volume at a fixed and or escalating price, and you can put that into a planning process, and that makes life easier for you. That's
And
number one.
You get certainty of the CO2 as well. I really like the model because you've got that dedicated renewable, so you're not subject to the whims of the grid or the market.
Still a big
price.
gap.
Yeah.
So then, natural gas here, we're somewhere here, whatever. Sort of natural gas is 2, 3, we're maybe 6 on a blended basis, maybe slightly less, maybe slightly more, depending on when we buy the kit and what it's going to cost. And then the question is the gradient. Are you willing to pay more now and make it flat for 15 years? Are you willing to peg to what? And this is where the electrolytic competition, one of the weaknesses is that you're effectively pegging to natural gas. A lot of industrial users want to decouple their kind of natural gas linkage. So if you want to decouple and literally flat your price, then you might be able to justify the difference between natural gas and my levelized cost of production. And then you have to take into account externalities. So what's my cost of carbon, CO2? How much does it cost today? How much is it going to cost in 15 years? No point showing me the next 3 years.
Well, that's the kind of the question. The guts of it is, are you now accounting for externalities?
You have to.
Yeah,
You
which
must.
all the way
Business
through the
selling
contract.
You
Yeah.
must do. And then if people
Yeah.
come back and say, oh, carbon's £80, you
Yeah.
say to them it's a ridiculous price. Obviously, you've never studied economics. Price of carbon is going to go through well over 200. The question is then convincing the client. And so you've got volatility, you've got unknown externalities, and you have to induce a sense of kind of fear. Now, let's go back to question one. If you induce that sense of fear to a fertilizer company, to steel company, that's an existential risk.
Mhm.
So they'll either say, I'm
You
going to,
don't need to do too much selling on that.
well, I mean, I'm going to shut down fertilizer and I'm going to go somewhere else. Or, hear no evil, see no evil,
Yeah.
and I don't want to deal with it until I'm told to deal with it. So you have to, again, go to customers, clients that are long-term, that have a strategy. And then at the end of the day, we deal with client sites. The site has a carbon profile. They've been told by their corporate to reduce that, hopefully to zero. They've done lots of things and they're here and zero's here. So how do you get down? And to be honest with you, I've been involved in lots of different technologies. There's very little that can get you all the way down there. Yes, you can electrify heat, but then, you know, you need massive interconnection. You know, there are lots of things you can do. You can put solar panels, you can do many, many different things, but very little to actually actionable that can get you, if you're an industrial site, from where you are to where you need to be. And that's the appeal of hydrogen. At least that's what we sell as the appeal for hydrogen.
Through pure fear. Talking then a bit more broad then about the UK market. So previously we've had a speaker from BOC come in and he talked about Kitty Brewster, the refueling station, and how BOC have been transporting and storing hydrogen around the UK successfully for several years. And more recently, of course, the results from High Deploy 1 and 2 were released, which then led to, I think it was all of Britain's gas grid companies confirming that by 2030, they will be able to blend up to 20% in the UK grid. When we're looking at distribution here today, what is the easiest way to scale up distribution in the UK? Or what do you think should be looked at further? Because some people say, you know, grid blending, it's a distraction right now. Let's focus on the easier wins. Some people say grid blending is absolutely necessary. Do you have an opinion on here today? How do we scale up distribution around the United Kingdom?
Look, as a developer, as a sort of person building an energy company, I think it's a distraction for me. I think it's the job for, you know, the gas utilities to worry about. If I need to meet a customer demand, I'm not going to use the gas grid because I'm going to be old before that happens, maybe not even around. So, you know, I'm going to go and build my facility.
So just ignore the grid completely and always focus then on.
Well, not in the short to medium.
Yeah. But that's what, as of here today.
The gas grid is, you know, will only essentially do when they're told by regulators and by government, and a lot of pressure will have to be applied. And do you want to expose your business model to government to that extent? I mean, especially for like over 50% of the output of your project. I think it's risky.
Checker, what do you think?
Of course, I think government has come up with some fairly innovative ideas. I think there's been talk about hydrogen neighborhoods, hydrogen villages, hydrogen towns. It's probably hydrogen countries after that, as in if you follow that progression. But I do agree with you, as in I think the onus in this regard probably does need to be taken on by the gas companies. But having said that, as in we have been in a, as in like I'll just give you a very specific example where we are right now located in the east of England. We have a small town next to Sizewell C, which is called Leiston. And one of the things that we are driving forward for Leiston is this, the local council there wants to turn the town net zero. So that's their ambition. And they want to turn net zero by 2030. And we as a project are supporting them in delivering that ambition. And the really interesting finding that we came to, and I must mention this, Leiston is by no means an outlier in this regard. It has pretty much the same level of carbon emissions, carbon consumption compared to a lot of other small towns and villages across the country. Is that at its current rate of consumption, it'll probably exhaust its carbon budget between now and the end of the century in the next 6.5 years. So that pretty much was the scale of challenge that is facing Leiston at the moment. So one of the ideas that we were thinking about in terms of, for example, Leiston is the role potentially that hydrogen could play. As a matter of fact, in terms of like a potential domestic consumption solution, if you can have hydrogen to drive that narrative forward. So in that regard, we were just having a few discussions, and essentially where we landed up was it's complicated, it is expensive, and again, like in the absence of any clear funding routes or outlets that might be viable or possible, how do you actually go about doing it? So in that regard, I think some of the government initiatives, for example, like the neighborhood plan or the village plan, that could be really helpful in terms of just demonstrating how a prototype concept could work. But until that point, there are probably other solutions which can be driven perhaps more effectively towards delivering these kind of net zero visions and outcomes. But hydrogen, grid blending, and everything else that is associated with it, it may just work, but it probably is still a fair bit away before it can be actually translated into concrete practice.
I feel like I spend at least 50% of my life at the moment effectively trying to moan about two things in the hydrogen sector. One is blue hydrogen for net importers of hydrogen, which I just think is madness, and the other is hydrogen for domestic heat. So I always say to the gas networks, like, if you own a transmission network and you make it hydrogen ready, I believe that at some point hydrogen will move through pipelines between A and B, like at large scale, because it's efficient and cheap. If you own the bit that goes from that transmission network or industrial cluster, etc., to people's homes, I mean, you might as well give up on that now, like, because we're never going to be able to afford to use hydrogen for domestic heat, especially green hydrogen. So if we're happy to live in a world where it's 30%, we get to, don't get to net zero, we get to net zero almost, and there's 30% left that's coming from methane with CCUS involved, then I'm like, fine, maybe it'll be expensive. It's more expensive than natural gas by definition, because you've got to do an extra process, but it might not be cripplingly expensive. But if we want a world that's net zero, where we're not subject to being importing natural gas and think how inefficient LNG is, etc., then there's just no viable conversation to have for me around hydrogen for domestic heat. Now, okay, the challenges in the UK are we've got poorly insulated housing stock, and there's a challenge there, but that doesn't mean that we can't solve that problem. There's countries that are much colder and they have big domestic district heating systems. They're much bigger on heat pumps and they invest heavily in insulation. So I just feel like it'll come down to fundamentally, it's not about just the efficiency argument, although the efficiency argument is pretty fatal for hydrogen for domestic heat. It's also going to be fundamentally about cost, and we cannot afford to be putting lots of homes through something that will just cost them too much. So I just don't think so. From our business perspective, I don't actually know why I do it, because it literally makes no difference to my business's success at all. I just feel like I'm being altruistic, trying to do something useful for the world. Because
as a CEO,
if they do or don't do hydrogen for domestic heat, actually wouldn't make a difference to them. Being bothered.
So then from your business models, because you were saying Protium always nearly near or on-site production for industrial, you're the opposite. In terms of then transportation around the UK, is then the answer going to be compressed hydrogen via road trailer? And is that just going to become,
I think whether it ends up being liquefied, gaseous, on the railway, in transmission pipes, depends on scale and market and offtake. I think, so we're open to all of those being possible.
But at the moment, you don't have a preferred
in the short
route.
term, we'll do gaseous mid-pressure, what I'd class as like 380 to 400, 500 bar kind of range on the road in tube trailers.
Yep.
It is inefficient. You are carrying about 120. Well, ideally using a hydrogen truck, but they're not ADR compliant yet.
Yeah.
But so but it's a 1/20th, I think, payload ratio. So it's pretty poor. So we get about 1 ton of hydrogen on a 44-ton truck overall. So but the trailer itself weighs about 30 tons. So it's a poor ratio. So that is fundamentally inefficient. If you did that in any other sector, you wouldn't do that. So it's only through necessity we're doing that. So there has to be a longer term better solution. So
and also there must be local community concerns also, right? With frequent traffic, transportation wise.
Yeah, it's typically not a problem in the planning process, because I guess people are. Because there's no wind turbines built anywhere, because everyone moans about wind turbines.
Sure.
Even though everyone loves wind turbines, but the planners moan about wind turbines, even though it's the same with that. People are, oh, this is really good. It's green hydrogen. We like it. It's the actual local community like it. And apart from if you're doing it in, the Cotswolds or something. Although we have got a project in the Cotswolds. So.
But that safety issue is a reoccurring theme that we come across quite a bit, is that community buy-in is quite important, because everyone automatically thinks worst case scenario. But
and one of my frustrations is, so we talk about giving consumers choice around hydrogen for domestic heat, and how, not everyone wants to have an air source heat pump. But I'm like, if you think about the economics of it, so you choose not to have a heat pump, but you have a house that could be built with one, or, because what you want is you want to be able to crank your thermos up and get to 60 degrees some points. Well, that's fine, but it shouldn't be for everyone else to pay your share of the cost of the natural gas grid, as there's a diminished number of people on that. There has to at some point be a strategy that says you have choice, but it has to be paid for by the participants who have that choice. And for those that receive benefits or some sort of social support mechanism, we make the best choice for them and society on behalf of what's the best for taxpayers and from net zero perspective. So the idea of social housing going down like hydrogen, I'm like, look, if you live in a mansion and you really want to be able to put your thermostat up to, whatever,
pay for it.
Yeah, cool, pay for it, but it's going to be absolutely cripplingly expensive. But if you really want to do it, do it. But The idea
dinner
of
table conversation, though.
but we can't be doing like, the boroughs of London with large amounts of social housing. It'd just be ridiculous.
One issue I want to jump on, it goes back to the commercial realities of in the UK at the minute. Do you have a minimum size project where you see commercial viability go from not viable into viable?
5 megawatts.
5 megawatts.
Sub 5 is not viable.
Beat me to the, 5.
5.
Preferably, I don't know. I mean,
And has that increased recently, or have you always nearly had that number in your head?
I think if I'd have known it 18 months ago, I'd have done a 5.
Yeah.
Because your fixed costs are the same, effectively. Like, so if you take away so component cost gets cheaper as you get to 5 from 1. But if you do a 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt project, a lot of your costs are the same. So like, you may as well do 5, but then you also get the economies of scale on the product side then, which starts to come down. So it's just a much better price point. To give you an idea, electrolyzers, a 1 mega electrolyzer, pretty much, let's say market price is 1.2 million. A 5 mega electrolyzer will be 3.5. So, like, it's just that one thing alone, the same ratios, it's slightly better on compression, it's just a complete no-brainer to go to the 5.
but for us, it's also about the cookie cutter thing that you mentioned before. You have to pick your technology, and then Siemens have the 8.8 basic silos of 100.
So you're going to be
For us-
dictated by Siemens.
Well, for us, it's a kind of like, it's a good enough proxy for industrial size. And again, it's all about trying to reduce the cost.
Yep.
And the projects can be expensive if we integrate our own renewables. So we have to go for like standardized cost, cookie cutter approach. And if that means choosing a certain size of technology, that so be it. I mean, we do have to marry that with industrial demand to the extent we can.
Because at Sizewell C, the original numbers being thrown around were circa 10 megawatts on hydrogen production.
Yeah.
And is that number stayed relevant today, or has that changed as your studies have gone and you've had discussions with the market?
Well, our thinking has changed slightly since those numbers first started being thrown around.
Yeah.
As in, when we first started thinking about hydrogen, we were thinking potentially about playing a role ourselves in the hydrogen production ecosystem. And of course, although Sizewell C is being constructed right now, we do have an existing nuclear power station right next to Sizewell C. We have Sizewell B there.
Yeah.
So that's something that we were thinking of. But then as we started doing a bit more thinking around what our hydrogen plants could look like linked to Sizewell C, we thought it'd be far more efficient in a way just to go and speak to the market about meeting our hydrogen needs for our buses and construction equipment. But equally at the same time, in terms of Sizewell C playing a role in the production aspect, one of the ideas that we currently have in mind is we will be actually extracting low carbon heat from the nuclear power station. So instead of converting all of our heat into electricity, we will be extracting some amount of heat, and we'll be using that heat to drive forward steam assisted electrolysis using solid oxide electrolyzer cell technology. Now that of course is linked to when Sizewell C itself becomes operational, which will be in about a decade or so's time, by which point the technology might have further evolved and matured.
We'd hope so.
We hope so. But at this point in time, we are focusing more on the consumption aspect.
Right.
But we are looking to bake in optionality now so that we can access the production aspect going forward in the future as well. But at that point, it might be 10 megawatts, it might be larger, it might be something else. But we have not taken any calls on that at this stage.
The reason there's a reason why it makes sense, I think, other than simple, like, so for example, a 40-foot tube drill in the UK can fit in about a ton of hydrogen, and a 5 megawatt site produces circa a ton, a day if you don't run it at high capacity factor. That happens to be a good coincidence. If you're running sub that, you're not getting the best bang for your buck in terms of the, vehicles that come and collect the hydrogen. And there's, you want to, if you push the burden of manufacturing back to manufacturers and not to your EPC, you can't really build bigger than say 5, 10, 15, 20 megawatts worth of as a product where you can sell it and it can be delivered and commissioned, because the EPC has to do it all. So at the moment, there's a kind of a sweet spot where the cost has come out of that kind of form factor and size. It fits quite well with a kind of operational perspective in terms of truck deliveries, etc. And also it kind of fits well with the amount of renewables you can actually, or power you can get access to. So, most grid connections in the UK that already existed that are over sort of 20, 30, 40 megs have been taken by battery sites. And so and most new renewables, solar sites are typically 5 to 70 meg, and well, there's no onshore wind apart from in Scotland, but when there is onshore wind, it's typically kind of hundreds of megs. So there's no real reason to be kind of, the 1 meg site just doesn't do enough for you. It's not viable. And for me, the kind of 200 meg kind of world, it's like, that's fine, but you're not getting any of these benefits. There's no renewables that fit your bill apart from offshore wind. You can't buy a product from anyone. You got to get into pipelines, not vehicles, because the whole thing becomes a different project, which is fine, but it's just it's a 5-year away problem. It's not a today problem, is the way we see that.
And talking about today problems, from your experience, have you identified anything that distinguishes a bankable project and a non-bankable project? And I know you could say, Carl, there's a list the size of my arm, but if we were to pick, say, your top 1 or 2.
Ask Jonathan that question.
Where do you start? Exactly. Exactly. And it is that issue of saying that there was capital available and that people are now and funds are, being driven in that way. But
what I would say is the definition of bankable isn't as basic as you might think, insofar as most people are comfortable with a degree of merchant risk in a project, i.e. that some of the hydrogen will not be sold, and especially the back end of the hydrogen. So, for example, we target on a contracted basis, so what we say is we separate out production sites from the delivery mechanism that sorts that out. So we can sort of guarantee that at a per project level, which is effectively site plus electrolysis plus compression, and then that's the end of that definition. That project will be targeting between a 12 and a 15% IRR on the basis of the gate price of the hydrogen we sell. And we look to not include any upside in the merchant hydrogen in that IRR. So that's all upside for anyone who came in and co-funded or took that site on. And there'll be about 50% of that will be guaranteed offtake for at least 10 years. So that's what we look for. Quite a basic definition to kind of get that over the line. And then we can comfortably deploy our own capital on there, and we're confident we can bring in other capital. So that works well. So if you're not meeting those criteria and it's like, yeah, we've got 2% offtake and it's for 1 year and I want to build it, I'm like, you're just not going to get that over the line. But you don't need 100% for 25 years with no merchant in there, which I think has been, so the market is ready to fund certain things, but you need to be at that 12% IRR. If you want to be at 8%, 6% IRR, great, but yeah, you're going to need a different set of kind of criteria at that point. And I think people at the moment see that merchant upside as quite a big one. And by the merchant upside, I don't mean, yeah, we're going to export it to, Germany and put it into their natural gas grid, because that's not going to be any upside in that commercially. It's more like, if you believe in the transition to net zero, there is going to be periods of the market being short green hydrogen. And if you can fulfill that short, you should have a decent merchant opportunity. And that's where most people seem to be viewing it. Now, I guess I value that more highly than infrastructure owners, because that's not their flavor. But typically there's a structure that comes whereby you can create some sort of, you underwrite a bit of that. You say we'll take the operational risk on it. People, yeah. So it's not as difficult as you might think. Is my position.
I mean, for us, our projects are either client specific, so we build infrastructure at the client site, or there are hub projects where you have multiple clients, and it's take or pay, minimum volume, minimum production, minimum pay, and the cash flow generates your DSCR, LLCR, and we're very old school, and my colleague Usman that runs everything in our business on the project finance side will correct me if I'm wrong, but it's hard to get over 60% debt on any meaningful kind of view of where we could get to.
But Mark, you've seen there's debt available then against your projects, because when I'm looking at it, really, when I'm talking about capital being available, I'm talking some sort of structure, typically with a large equity sleeve coming in from an investor. It's not like debt.
I'm going to bring that up. It's my personal passion, and I've done first of a kind in different sectors, and hydrogen. I've been the first IGCC debt, the first gasification debt in the world, the first West Ham. So hydrogen is going to be I'm going to drag the banks kicking and screaming to do these deals. And we're helped by Stevenson Harwood their team to get the offtake. So yes, I mean, we're going to traditional off-takers have to be bankable, their covenants have to be adequate.
Yeah.
That's why we talked about the EPC and
so you're
the
struggling because you're
O&M.
given your service covenant ratios and all that.
Very
stuff to
traditional
fit.
project financing. And look, they're going to kick and they're going to scream and they're still not going to like it. But at the end, they're going to do it. How much is there for the upside? Not convinced. I don't know how much. You know, if you structure everything for the downside, you're limiting your upside.
Yeah.
But there is upside. The upside is, you know, the electrolyzer is not, you know, scientific. So we're going to have some production that's dedicated to our own use. Let's say we're going to have battery on site, we're going to have storage, and battery storage can be viewed both as protecting the offtake, but also as optionality.
Yeah.
We then sell electricity and hydrogen to a lot of off-takers, and we can arbitrage the value of the electrons versus the molecules.
Would you, for example, though, are you looking at pre-selling or getting a guaranteed price for, say, the RTFO element of your project? Because it's funny, because one of the ones we're getting is a lot of people want us to forward sell the RTFO to de-risk it, whereas I'm like, I want to keep the RTFO. So, you know, they're definitely worth 80p.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone goes, no, they're not, they're worth 77. I'm like, fine, okay, well, so you can have them at 77 as long as you buy 10 years worth.
Yeah.
But, you know, whereas what they want is you to sell them, oh, well, you need to de-risk your project, I'll give you 40p for 10 years. I'm like, well, it's just a terrible trade. I'd rather, I can find the money from somewhere else to deal with this. So there's just no deal.
It's kind of the balance between what you need to give to have certainty and then how much debt you can raise. So, you know, at the moment, if you throw all the ingredients
you can get debt off the RTFO as well.
Yeah.
Well done.
I think so.
This sounds like a glass of wine discussion.
I think we have to, we have to go to banks and talk to them. Look, I mean, they've done things before. I remember, I'm so old that I remember the 90s when there were 100% merchant project financings. So whenever they say we don't take merchant risk, I remind them, even take the documents out and say, you sign these documents.
Well, one, I guess, caveat I'd add. So one of my frustrations is, you know, there's institutions that are announced, you know, by government, etc., that are looking to support these sort of things. But then let's say the remit doesn't necessarily give them the flexibility sometimes to do this. And I feel like that, you know, I'm not saying, I can't remember the one that, what's his name, Shah in a US runs, the US infra bank equivalent, you know which one I mean?
Oh, Generate Capital.
The one now he's gone over to.
Yeah.
But, you know, like trying to go really big on supporting those sort of things from a government perspective first to allow private markets to come in afterwards. I feel like we don't have a great model for that in the UK. You know, it's pretty much over straight to commercial lenders on day one. You know, we don't have a lot of that kind of interim support.
There's nothing I've seen in hydrogen over the last few years that makes me think that, you know, a bank wouldn't lend to it.
Yeah.
I mean, do you know how complex a gas turbine is? It's really, really scary.
Yeah, but you're always on the selling side, Mark.
Sorry?
So of course it's going to be easy.
I don't know. I mean, you know, we're designing our projects to be ultra, you know, Will would say ultra conservative, so that when we go to the bank, they'll still say that they're quite risky. But you know, we're designing them with as many belts and braces. Of course, you know, it helps your WACC, it helps your LCOH. Yeah. I mean, look, if we have to, we'll use sub debt. If we have to, we'll use more equity, but it just pushes the price up.
Yeah.
Will the first project be optimally structured? Probably not. Will it have too much equity? Yes. And then you can refinance this, phase 2, phase 3. So we're already in discussions, very preliminary with banks about, well, if you oversize the equity, you can refi. And then what's your model going to be? Well, I mean, you know, are you going to fix 15 years of debt? I wouldn't. I mean, I would use a mini perm structure, but personally, because you know the technology and costs are going to come down. So, you know, you lock in your debt for a period of time. Once construction's gone, that's a big risk. Yeah. 2 years of operation, then you have an asset you can refinance. I honestly believe that our integrated infrastructure is less like a project, more like a company. And that's my selling spiel to the banks, and they'll be able to look at that as you know, as a corporate.
Checker, from your perspective, you get a range of technologies considering the nuclear, direct air capture, and hydrogen. So, from your experience, when it comes to bankability, or anything screaming out, or is that mostly what the gentlemen have touched on already?
Well, I think when we go and have and we are having a number of discussions at the moment with banks, but that's more to do with our nuclear project, which is a very significant financing that we're looking at the moment for Sizewell C as a project. So, and for that, of course, the narrative is very different compared to.
That's a serious financing.
That's a
not
serious
the kind of
financing.
financing that we're doing.
That's a big financing that we are currently engaging with the market on. But apart from that, insofar as hydrogen, and of course, you mentioned direct air capture, which is actually something else that we are also very actively exploring at the moment. I fully agree with what Marco and Will said as in terms of the key elements of the narrative. If anything, I would say like direct air capture, it's probably even slightly behind the hydrogen insofar as the narrative curve is concerned, because like where we are right now, and we are actually currently participating in this government competition on direct air capture projects, which I was informed today. There will be a public announcement tomorrow as to the successful projects.
Okay.
So fingers crossed that will actually happen and it won't be overtaken by all the other announcements that are currently being made. So we'll find out. But again, so we are looking to develop a prototype direct air capture project.
Yeah.
And for that, of course, that will be funded by government. But our ambition is to actually take that forward and make it bankable in its own right. But just given its current TRL levels right now, where it is, I think it's even further behind hydrogen. But hopefully, as in we will be where hydrogen is getting to at the moment so that we can drive these other technologies forward as well.
Appreciating time, we've had one question here. Do the panelists, particularly Will, have thoughts on hydrogen-fueled FC CHP for domestic heat or any other end users?
Fuel, so hydrogen for CHPs, sort of Ceres power sort of style stuff, I guess.
Domestic.
For domestic heat or other end users. Nice, easy question.
For answering questions on domestic, I was going to avoid that like the plague.
So I suppose in the short term, like I guess CHP isn't a terrible product because like it's more efficient to generate power and heat combined even at domestic levels. So I actually like Ceres' product set. Yep. So I think in a world of not net zero, there's definitely a time and a place. I guess, I wouldn't be long that product in a net zero world just because, again, the inefficiency. I mean, it's more efficient than just a gas boiler, but a lot of the costs of the hydrogen are still there, and they're compared to an air source heat pump, and then say, others. I'm probably not long it in the long term. I mean, it's not investment advice.
Well, the Carbon Trust, this individual's come back again saying, Marco, I'd also be keen to hear about other use cases, including industrial. So you're off the domestic heat question, but CHP.
But assuming Marco's put it, kind of like CHP in the industrial scale. You're using the heat and the power from the electrolyzer.
Exactly.
So it's kind of is doing that.
It is de facto CHP. We're either using it or we're producing it.
Yeah.
So we can use low-grade waste heat to help with the electrolyzer, but we can also help to generate waste heat.
Yeah. Well,
not always very efficiently, but
Well, this is it. So we take a diesel genset project that we've been working on. So like they're great because a fuel cell is not the best solution in the world, but it's pretty good. It's about 50% efficient, so it's twice as good as a combustion engine. Let's say, unless you're in an F1 car, it's good.
Yeah.
But you still got, but 100 kVA system is still producing 50 kilowatts worth of spare heat, which is quite a lot of heat, and it's low grade heat. But if you're applying that to a site and there's welfare cabins and there's, you can put a heat exchanger for hot water, you can get like effectively a combined efficiency of circa 80% of the site total.
Which is pretty good.
Which all of a sudden is like really good. And you don't need to do that for the economics to stack up relative to diesel, especially when you take account of then the externalities. But when you then add all that in, it becomes really compelling. So like, I think using heat from electrolysis wisely, acknowledging that it is low grade heat is a really great thing to do, full stop, and the more projects that can do that. Now, obviously, then you get people saying, you can put it in a car, and it's not going to work on all those things. But like, when you need not very good heat, it's really good.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, appreciating timing and the fact that there are beverages outside the door here, that is the last of my questions. So I'm going to pass back to Jonathan.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed. All I really want to do is to thank all three of you so much for that, because considering we posed one question, which was, are the targets going to be reached? And within 5 minutes, you said no, which rather could have wrecked the plot for this evening. Actually, that was a tremendously interesting debate between the three of you. And I think what struck me was, though you're all coming at this from different perspectives, actually there are way more similarities between you than there are differences. So thank you, the three of you, very much indeed. My thanks to Carl for moderating our discussion. So if we can please show our appreciation for all our speakers.